I will kick us off and then hand it over to Tim. Let me get on camera. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our first monthly RPM training. For those that don't know, my name is Lee Lattimore. I am the Restoration and Investigation Manager in the Restoration and Site Evaluation Branch. I started at the agency as an on-scene coordinator 18 years ago. Please don't do the math. I worked as a federal facility RPM and then moved to the private side of Remedial, where I did everything from site assessment work to deletion work and everything in between. These trainings are for the RPMs, but my hope is anyone involved in Superfund could not only benefit from them, but also bring something to the table. So thank you all for being here. The purpose of the monthly trainings are to help you identify who the subject matter experts are. As we all know, being in this virtual world for the last 3 years, it makes it hard to know sometimes who to talk to about a particular topic. So hopefully this will help address that by identifying subject matter experts. My hope is that it will also help you understand the process. For example, if you did a deletion of a site 10 years ago, the process for deleting a site has changed. So my hope is that these trainings will bring clarity to a particular process. And then these trainings will hopefully bring consistency to how we address our Superfund remedial sites, as well as bring awareness to new and updated guidance. With that said, I would really like these trainings to be interactive and engaging. I really think that everyone learns from each other, so please don't be shy about asking questions or sharing your own particular experiences. Before I hand it over to Tim, I just wanted to highlight our upcoming topics. They're all really important ones, and I'm really excited about them. I've got a number of topics to last us for the next couple of years. So these are just, the next 6 months, what it looks like. And I will be updating the meeting invite with the particular topic for that month. So with that said, I will now hand this over to Tim. And I really appreciate, again, you all being here. So thank you. All right, Tim.
Thanks, Lee. I will try to I'll get my camera going and try to get my screen shared. Let's see.
No one judged him on how long it takes him to pull up his
Well,
presentation.
I'm trying to share it on PowerPoint, and I have about 16 PowerPoints open, so it's like picking the right one.
No, I know.
I'm shocked you're in your office, Tim.
I'm not in my office. That's my background. That's a pro move. Take a picture of take a picture of your office and use it as your background. Is this showing up? How's it showing up on your end?
We can see it.
You got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, great. Thanks for having me. I see lots of new names, lots of old names in the folks who are here. So thanks for joining me. For those of you who don't know me or haven't met me, I'm Tim Frederick. I'm the chief of the scientific support section, which includes all of the risk assessors and the consulting hydrogeologists. I've been with the agency about 16 years. Most of that was as a human health risk assessor. I worked for the agency as a contractor 10 years before that. So I've been doing in the risk assessment game for some time. Outside of EPA, I teach at the Emory School of Public Health a class on human health risk assessment, and I know there is at least one person on who has suffered through the long form of that. So I only have 2 hours to take that semester's worth of information and distill it down to what's useful here. But I tried to make today's presentation as applicable to what you guys do as RPMs as possible. I'd like for you to go ahead and just ask questions as we go. Um, and I see in the comments that Drew has outed himself as the person who has had my semester-long class. Yeah, ask questions as we go. Either it's on the mic or throw something in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat. But let's dive in. I'm talking about the basics of risk assessment, and to showcase my biases. Um, yeah, I left the human health part silent there. So this is really the basics of human health risk assessment. Ecological risk assessment is different, and it's in its own thing, and hopefully that'll be a future monthly topic is getting the basics of eco risk assessment. So let's begin with the basics. What is a risk assessment? And first and foremost, it's a process. It was glad to hear Lee talking about you know that each month you guys will be dealing with a different process. Risk assessment is a formal process. It focuses on analyzing risks to current and future um, potentially exposed populations caused by hazardous substances released from a site. We put numbers to that for a lot of different reasons. We quantify those risks in most cases. Sometimes we'll do what we call a qualitative risk assessment, is it safe or unsafe, but usually we're putting numbers to it for reasons that we'll dive into later. And the risk assessment process aids in a lot of the things that you as RPMs are responsible for, and we'll touch on those. But sites risk assessments should always be site specific and will vary in their detail and scope accordingly. Hang on, Lee. I need to check something out real quick. Sorry. Yeah, I have a version control issue. Hang on one second.
Okay. Take
I
your
was
time.
seeing my slide count in the background. I was like, that's not right. So let me X out of that. No, I'm still there.
Yeah, well, maybe unshare and then
Yeah.
while Tim's doing that, does anyone have any questions about this monthly training?
Okay, that's gone. And I am just going to share. I'm going to do this the way that I know it will work.
There you go.
And share the slides that I intend to share. All right, so you guys can see that, and let me get the comments going over there. Perfect, and let's dive in. So these are the slides I should have been working with. So starting over a little bit, why are we starting with risk assessment? Why is it the first one that we're talking about? And that's there's several good reasons for starting off this series of conversations with risk assessment. And one is that documenting an unacceptable human health or eco risk is our basis for taking actions at most of our sites. We can't take actions in most cases unless we have demonstrated and quantified an unacceptable risk. So we might feel like we need to do something at a site, or it might be a good idea, or the community would feel good if we took an action at a site. But without demonstrating a quantified unacceptable risk, in most cases, we're unable to go ahead and take that action. The risk assessment is providing information to you risk managers. It helps to establish risk-based cleanup goals, and it informs decisions. In the NCP, there's this excerpt here that documents this. It says, using the data developed, we have to conduct a site-specific baseline risk assessment at all of our sites as part of the remedial investigation feasibility study and the selection of remedies. And the results of that baseline risk assessment will help establish exposure levels for developing remedial alternatives in the FS. So it's pretty fundamental, and it's right there in the NCP. We need to do risk assessments. In the feasibility studies, we have 9 criteria that we use to evaluate. Number 1 under the threshold criteria is overall protection of human health. So we demonstrate that protection of human health by doing a risk assessment. Also in the balancing criteria is reduction of toxicity. That again is a risk assessment function. So again, risk is front and center in your RI and in your FS. In your 5-year reviews after sites are done, we're asked, is the site still protective? That is a human health and ecological risk assessment question. Are we still meeting that threshold criteria, our number 1 criteria, protection of human health and the environment? Question B gets into some things like, are the exposure assumptions, tox data, cleanup levels, remedial action objectives used at the time of the remedy selection still valid? And those of you who have gone through the 5-year review process have probably encountered situations where that's not the case. Numbers that were developed in 1992 may not be protective based on what we know today. They were protective at the time, but things changed. So again, your risk assessor is getting involved in your sites and helping you to make these decisions so that the protectiveness statement that you are signing off on is based on good science. So here, we've already talked about this slide. What is risk assessment? It's a process. Who performs a risk assessment? This can vary, just like a lot of the work on the sites. It can be PRPs, it can be EPA contractors, depending on if it's a fund lead or a PRP lead site. It could be, yeah, I didn't put this on here explicitly, but it could be a federal facility, which would be the lead agency on the site. I kind of lump them in with PRPs. And in some cases, we can do it for you, the scientific support section. We tend not to be your primary source of risk assessments, because just keeping up with all of the documents that you're sending over keeps us pretty busy. But there have been a few situations since I've been here where we've jumped in and have done the risk assessments for RPMs at sites due to circumstances like we didn't have any funding or the timing, those types of things. So it will vary, but in the end, the scientific support section will weigh in. Was the risk assessment done properly? Or are there things that should have been changed, et cetera? We can provide those comments to you so that when you're making your remedy selections at your site, choosing your cleanup goals, that it's based on good information. A quick overview of our risk assessment process and how it's evolved. It kind of begins in 1980 when the Superfund statute was released. In 83, a document called the Red Book was released that kind of laid out the format for how risk assessments should be done across the federal government. It wasn't EPA specific. The Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act came out in 86, which kind of provided a little bit of guidance. EPA's first stab at risk assessment guidance was something called the Superfund Public Health Evaluation Manual. And that was kind of quickly superseded in 1989 by RAGS Part A and B, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So in 83, the National Academy of Sciences released this document. It's called the Red Book because it had a red cover. And it outlined the 4 basic steps of governmental risk assessments, very high level. And those 4 steps are kind of used in risk assessments, not just by the US government, by just pretty much everyone doing risk assessments, and provided a really solid framework for how we're doing risk assessments. And that kind of laid the groundwork for our risk assessment guidance for Superfund, which has a much less vibrant cover than the Red Book. So there's a couple of things interesting. It was intended to update that Superfund Public Health Evaluation Manual. It got rid of a lot of the public health language and switched things over to kind of risk assessment. It was intended to be finalized upon final circular revision of the NCP. And so this came out in December 89, and it has the interesting um, title here of interim final. I'm not sure what interim final was. It was final, but intended to be interim in 1989. There has never been an update to this document since 89. And there's a lot of you on the phone who are um, not as old as this document. uh, but it wasn't the last word on how EPA conducts risk assessment. There's been a lot of guidance, and I've laid out some of these, starting, with the interim final 1989 document, um, and on and on. And I kind of ran out of enthusiasm for laying it all out when I got to about 2008, but et cetera. But there's a ton of guidance that's intended to tell risk assessors how to implement the risk assessment guidance for Superfund. So, we get to keep up with all of that info. I mentioned that the Red Book laid out the 4 steps, and this is what they are. There's hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. Those are our 4 key components. I'm going to go through each of those in some detail as we go. So let's start with our hazard identification. A hazard is a potential source of harm. And so in that step, we're identifying things at our sites that may be potential hazards, and and under what circumstances that may occur. I was just talking about this drum on a previous phone call. Sometimes, the hazard identification, does this stuff present a risk? Is pretty straightforward. This was at a removal site. This is a drum of a pesticide that was left in a barn with a bunch of others. It was almost like a banned pesticide museum. But if you read this label, it's 40% toxaphene, 20% DDT, 35% petroleum hydrocarbons as a carrier. Yes, this is a potential hazard. We have identified something that could be potentially harmful to people. Um, a lot of our sites kind of look something like this, though, where there's just past operations, and we have to figure out what the hazards are. We have to go out, we have to look at site history. We have to start collecting samples to figure out what the potential hazards are and if there are chemicals in the environment that may present a potential concern to people who can come into contact with them. So we kind of start with the beginning, is trying to figure out what contaminants have been released at the site, for how long, how much, um, what were the characteristics of that source, where was it released, um, what media was it originally discharged to, where has that may that release end up. Just because something was released to soil doesn't mean that's where it's going to stay. It can migrate to groundwater, it can volatilize into the air, it can do all sorts of things. So we have to consider, all of what we know at the beginning about what's known or suspected to have occurred. Usually, when we show up, we're not the first persons on the scene, unless it's a removal site. On the remedial side, the site has gone through some investigation. We have some general idea what's going on. It's been referred to us by a state. There's been a site assessment. We have some data to start to answer these questions. But then we jump into our data quality objectives step, where in our systematic planning, if we're doing our sampling at a site correctly, this is where we're starting. And I'll just throw out to Lee. I think that's a great topic for a future training is talking about this, building your data quality objectives for your site. Our risk assessors can get involved at this point with your site, and I highly recommend that you do involve your risk assessors, human and eco risk assessors, in the discussion about the samples that are going to be collected at your site, because we may have some requirements or some strong ideas about what we need in order to, or what the risk assessors who will do the risk assessment will need to do the to do their jobs properly and have good data to build their risk assessments on. I won't spend too much time here, but generally data quality objectives are centered around doing some detailed thinking about why you're collecting the data. What, every sample you should be able to answer, why are you collecting that sample? Why there? What are you going to do with the data? Sometimes I've been on sites where folks have said, let's just take some samples to show that nothing's that's not an issue, which is always that never goes well. You should have a detailed plan about the samples that you're going to collect, what you're going to do with the data, the decision criteria that you're going to apply to it, and things like that. But again, this is probably a good topic for a whole 2-hour session on its own. When you get the data, as part of the risk assessment process, we'll want to evaluate that data quality and completeness. We're going to compare it to background where applicable, and we'll need a good background data set. And we can help ensure that we have an adequate background data set for your site. We'll compare to some risk-based screening criteria on RSLs for remedial sites typically. And from all of this, we can identify our contaminants of potential concern. You'll typically collect a lot of samples, have a lot of analyses done on them. We'll have laundry lists of chemicals. In this step, we want to pare down that laundry list of chemicals and determine which ones we want to carry forward as COPCs. And by COPCs, I mean the chemicals that we're going to carry forward into our risk assessment. So our data evaluation process looks like this in the risk assessment guidance for Superfund. I'm not going to walk you through this matrix, but data evaluation is not something that is that should be taken lightly. In our risk assessment, we're going to kind of go over this pretty carefully and make sure that we have good data. I see a couple questions popping up, and I will get to those in just a sec. As part of our analysis of the data, we'll want to look at your data validation report. And if you've collected some data, the lab will give you something that looks like this. And then there'll be some qualifiers as part of their validation process, where you'll start to see J's and U's and things that show up here. Just kind of looking at this quickly, can anybody spot a qualifier here that would give you some concern, or would lead you to think that maybe this data is not up to snuff for use in a risk assessment? All right, and Quinn wins the door prize for picking out the R. There's an R here as one of the qualifiers. For those of you who are not familiar with an R, and hopefully your data has been R-free, the R means that there are some serious data quality issues. The data are rejected and considered unusable. So if your data has R's in it, and it's not usable for decision making, it's not usable for risk assessment purposes. So we're going to either have to go out and resample this or figure out if it's an issue
Tim,
going forward. Yeah,
Tim, is that for all the data or just that potential
it's
contaminant concern? Just that chemical?
it's just for this chemical, but it kind of um, this is for dioxin. So this chemical got rolled into the dioxin TEQ.
Hmm.
So our dioxin TEQ was not usable. We ended up having to resample. Um, what was interesting in this case, just as another issue, is that we were trying to be very um, transparent in this community, and we gave them the lab results the day that we got them. We're like, and that was an agreement that we made, and we hadn't really had a chance to look at them. And like half an hour later, they called back and said, "This data's garbage. You have you have rejected data." We're like, great.
Well, just as a plug for the September training, we have the do's and don'ts of sharing data results, which you're a
Right,
part of. So I'm sure
right,
that that lesson learned will be brought in.
right. Skim the qualifiers and make sure you have good data before you share it. Is a good and solid tip. Um, so, as part of our quality assurance, quality control things, we look at what are called the park parameters. So we want to look at the precision and accuracy, and there are things that should be part of your validation. They have looked at that. Um, some others, representativeness. You can collect a lot of data at your site, and if it's not representative of your site, um, you may be missing the boat in some very important ways. So it's always important to make sure that your data is representative of your site, that it represents site conditions in their totality. And so, yeah, if you have questions about that, you can reach out to us as part of our data, yeah, as part of that DQO or systematic planning step. The other piece that sometimes overlooked is completeness. And what that means is you've put together a SAP. You've got a QAP that's laying out all the things that you're going to do. Um, we should go back and look and make sure that we actually did collect all the data that we set out to, or for site specific reasons. Did we miss a bunch of sites, a bunch of samples? Did a cooler get lost? All of those things. Make sure that you have all the data that you set out, um, and then is the data comparable? Um, that's when we take duplicates, or if we're doing incremental sampling, which I'm a big proponent of. Yeah, triplicates, is the data comparable? Are you getting similar results between samples? Should be part of that. So if you've got good data, then we can start moving on and can start using it in our risk assessment. I had a question about screening data. Again, we're screening the data for the purposes of narrowing down just that whole laundry list of data that we get from the lab to our contaminants of potential concern. And we do that by doing some data screening. We will look at backgrounds where that's applicable, usually for inorganics, metals. Um, and we'll look at risk-based screening levels. These are typically our regional screening levels, which I'll talk more about later, but they're calculated using toxicity values, default exposure assumptions, chemical specific physical and chemical properties for specific targets. Um, and get into what that means. So this is just a screen grab of our regional screening levels table. And I've truncated it a bit, so we're just looking at chemical names. But you can see that for there's screening levels that have been developed for residential soil, residential air, industrial air, tap water, and the MCL is added just for completeness. It may or may not be risk based. It's not a regional screening level. The MCL is something that the Office of Water puts together, but that is added to the table as well. So Rob asked in the comments, what is recommended if the state uses levels lower than RSLs? Um, the state is welcome to do whatever they like. um, on the EPA side, we will use our regional screening levels. Now, you may be at a federal facility where you have a tri-party agreement to do something else. You may, if you've got SCTLs in the state of Florida, maybe the three-party agreement is we'll use whichever is lower, the RSL or the SCTL. But if it's a fund lead site or a PRP lead site and there's not, the state is there um, at our invitation and not a part of a tri-party written agreement, um, we we use ours. So Rob is going to ask, what if the state levels are promulgated? Then it's an ARAR, and we can come back and look at the ARARs later. But for purposes of a circular risk assessment, we're kind of beginning with regional screening levels, and again, we can consider others if needed. In our risk assessment, we'll document this screening. It'll look this is risk assessment guidance for Superfund Part D, laid out some standardized tables that should be in your risk assessments. When you're documenting your screening, that you're trying to narrow this down to your contaminants of potential concern. You'll have each chemical that's at your site, and maybe this is the full laundry list. There'll be a minimum, a maximum, the location of your maximum, the frequency of detection, range of detection limits, the concentration used for screening, and there's an asterisk here, so you could put in, we used RSLs, we use the lower of the RSL or the state of Florida SCTLs, whatever the case may be. You identify what your screening level is. You can include background values. These are organic chemicals, so typically things like benzoyl phthalate are not background contaminants, et cetera. And so the last column here is, the last two, is it a COPC? Has it been identified as a contaminant of potential concern? These are all labeled no because they are below the screening level. So there are COPCs at the site, they just weren't located at the top. So when you've gone through, you've got good high quality data, you've screened it, you've identified your contaminants of potential concern. Now you're able to move into the next step of the risk assessment, which is our exposure assessment. So what's exposure? Exposure is the contact between chemical, biological, or physical agent and the outer boundary of a person or other organism. So it's there's something harmful in the environment. We're primarily interested in chemicals, radiologic, um, uh, radionuclides could be included in there, but they're coming into contact with a person, so that such that that contaminant or radionuclide can enter into the body where it can cause harmful effects. So to do that, what that outer boundary means is that the contaminant is either being inhaled, it's being ingested, or it's coming into contact with skin. These are the three that most of the time we're dealing with. When John Richards is involved, ionizing radiation is pulled in as well. That's a physical hazard as well. But exposure is key. We have some, this is a busy kind of diagram, but on the left is your stressor, your thing in the environment that can cause harm. Once it comes into contact with a person, then there's the potential for there to be some sort of health effect on the outcome. So exposure is key. This is not a real equation, but another way to think about it is you have a hazard that we've identified in step one and some exposure, which are or potential exposure, which we're identifying here in step 2, and that is a result of that can be risk. So just because a chemical is released does not necessarily mean that there's a high risk situation. We have to look at the exposure to understand if there's people who are going to be able to come into contact with this, and if so, what's the dose that they're going to be exposed to, and I'll get into that in a moment. But a key part of the exposure assessment is what's called a conceptual site model. It identifies things like the source of the contamination, release and transport mechanisms, exposure media, exposure routes, and potentially exposed populations, whether they exist now or just theoretical, they could exist in the future, which is pretty broad, right? So these are all the things that you want to capture in your conceptual site model. This is a conceptual site model from one of our sites. I took it out of an appendix in a risk assessment that I was looking at. And it kind of begins here with what's our primary source. It was leached to surface soil and subsurface soil. It continued to be, went to surface soil, surface water, sediment, groundwaters. Our exposure media, where people could come into contact, are laid out here: surface soil, surface water, sediment, indoor air, groundwater, subsurface soil. Our exposure routes: ingestion, inhalation, dermal contact for each of these is looked at. The current receptors and the future receptors are laid out. What I like about conceptual site models and why I think they should be developed well before the risk assessment is you can use them as a uh, as kind of a cheat sheet to make sure that you're getting the data that you need. If these are the potential exposure media as a result of our understanding of the site, if I didn't sample surface water at the site, I'm missing the boat. I didn't get all the data that I needed. Similarly, for risk assessors, when we're looking at current and future receptors, there's a trespasser here. If I don't have quantified risk for the trespasser, I haven't fully evaluated all the potential risks at the site. So it's a good checklist to make sure you have the data that you need up front to do the risk assessment. And it kind of lays out a game plan for all the media and receptors that you need to evaluate within the risk assessment. So again, I think the CSM can start, it could be part of the data quality objectives phase, the systematic planning phase. It doesn't need to be this formal or laid out like this, but I think it's a key part of our discussion of the site, and it's a great way when you're scoping the site to make sure that everybody's on the same page about the site as well.
Can I
Yeah,
interject quickly? I just, I want to just put in a plug for your help at Westside Lead during the remedial investigation work plan. And, we had all of our partners involved, our stakeholders, so we all knew what our conceptual site model looked like and what we were going to sample for. So I completely
absolutely.
agree the importance of this early on in the process.
Yeah. Um, at this same site, what we do less of, and I'm a big fan of, is putting together a graphical conceptual site model. So this is great for engineers and risk assessors to kind of look at, but throwing this picture up at a public meeting isn't going to further understanding of anything. It can cause a lot of confusion. A picture like this has all of the same elements, but it's sort of laying things out graphically. This is the Walker Machine site. This is Randy Bryant's site, where we can see where the contaminants were released. We can see where the buildings are. We could see where the surface water and sediments are. We can see where the groundwater is, and in relation to that, it's all laid out here. And there's information at the bottom that provides some additional information, but it's a much more intuitive story. Um, yeah, Lee was talking about the west side lead site. This is from the south side Chattanooga lead site, where we developed a conceptual site model. We kind of adapted this one for west side lead because they were very similar, same contaminants. But this conceptual site model tells the story. We had historical foundries that were located um, in Chattanooga, very many of those. They had spent foundry sand where dump trucks came and they used it as fill material at houses. Um, this talks about the potentials, you can see graphically what the potential exposures are, but this was useful in communicating to the public. You could see, that the foundry sand has this kind of hatching that we've shown in some yards, but not all the yards. And this was kind of instructive when we were talking to the community. We use this in in public meetings to explain, kind of what was going on, but why we were digging up one person's yard and not your yard or the next door yard. Um, so it's great, and this tells the story, and I think that we should do more of this. So you RPMs who are in charge of budgets and contractors can ask for this. Ask your contractors to put together a graphical CSM that tells the story. And it doesn't have to be complicated. When we're in a scoping meeting, you can use something that looks like this. This was shared with me by a Region 8, somebody, an ATSDR rep in Region 8 who was asking me about a site. And he was just trying to tell me what was going on. And he kind of did this in, I think, Microsoft Paint or something. And then while we were talking, he kind of drew up this picture to talk about what was going on. And you can look at this and understand what's happening here, right? It's a mining site. Mine waste is going into the creek. Here's the potential receptors that are out there. We were able to talk about the site and move on. And I was like, hey, I'm grabbing a screen capture. So when I'm talking about conceptual site models, um, I can show it doesn't have to be complicated. You can sketch something up um, really quickly. But again, it helps to understand who do we need to look at? What are the risk pathways that we need to look at? What are the contaminated media we need to consider? All of that. And we can get on the same page and start scoping our sampling here. So a big fan of graphical conceptual site models. So again, RPMs, if you have the chance, ask your contractors to put something like this together for you for your sites. It's great. And again, it's ready to go for your public meetings when you start talking about telling the community what's going on and why you're sampling, where you are, and what's happening at the site. And it's way more intuitive than showing them this. Okay. And it's also a table in your risk assessment. So table 1 in the RAGS Part D tables looks like this, where you're laying out by each media, here's the surface soil, who are the potential receptors, um, and the rationale for selection or exclusion of the exposure pathway. So sometimes there may be a potentially complete pathway, but it's not going to be an important pathway or considered minimal. So we can lay out here um, that um, what we're going to be looking at and what we're not and why, and that rationale is important. In your risk assessor or the folks reviewing your risk assessment will want to look at that. They may have a question looking at the site. Well, why didn't you look at groundwater? And in the table or in your text, it should lay out groundwater as a potential pathway, but maybe not important here due to the fate and transport of the contaminant. Another key distinction to take home today is the difference between concentration and dose. So what we get from the lab is our concentration in soil and groundwater, um, and that's informative. It's part of what we need to do in a risk assessment. But again, what we're interested in as risk assessors is how much of this soil is getting to that boundary, is getting inside the person where it can cause harm. And that's a dose, right? So the dose is how much is able to enter the body based on its concentration in the environment. So we need to know that concentration in the environment, but we need to calculate this dose. Our risk assessors need to calculate that dose. And so we do that with a dose equation that looks something like this. So the chronic daily intake or the daily exposure, this will be called different things depending on which guidance document you're looking at. But essentially, this is the dose. So we have a concentration, the C term here, concentration in water. That's what we got from the lab, but we're plugging it in here to calculate that daily dose. Other things that are in this equation, I didn't label all of my factors here on purpose. This is just to kind of let you know that the concentration in the environment is only part of it. Other exposure factors that are here are the ingestion rate. You know, how much, yeah, we know the concentration of groundwater, but how much groundwater do people drink each day? That's a very important one. The exposure frequency is how often do they drink the water? The exposure durations, how long do they drink the water? Uh, 5 years, 10 years. In the bottom is our body weight times our averaging time, and the averaging time is a separate calculation that gets put in here. So we need to be able to plug all those things into our risk equations. Let's start with the exposure point concentration, or the C. So you may have sampled groundwater wells, 80 wells at a site. Are you going to run this equation for each well, or are you going to calculate an exposure point concentration, one number for that? Usually that's what we'll do is, we'll calculate this C based on all the data that we have, or all the data in a decision unit, or all the data in an operable unit, whether that's soil or whatever. We're going to not have um, every sample plugged in here, but a representative number that represents our site, that's representative of the sampling that we've done. So to do that, we typically will use a conservative estimate of the mean. So we want to make sure that we're not underestimating the mean. So we calculate a statistic called the 95% UCL, the UCL 95. It's the 95th percentile upper confidence limit on the mean. So what that means is we're 90% sure that we're not underestimating the mean, that the true mean 95% of the time will be less than our number that we're calculating. That's what that number means. In highly variable data sets, sometimes that number can exceed the max. In that case, we would use the max, we use the lower of the UCL 95 or the maximum concentration. And again, in our risk assessment, we're documenting this in our RAGS Part D tables, where we have we have the mean here. We have our 95% upper confidence limit of the mean. We have our max, and then we go through and identify which one we picked. And this rationale column at the end gets heavy into statistics. Some different UCLs were selected based on the pro UCL outputs. A future session, we could talk 2 hours about how to use pro UCL, which is an EPA software tool for calculating these. I won't go very much more into it than this today. The take home is that we're coming up with a conservative estimate of the mean for this number. So that's our starting point for figuring out our dose. Next up, we have to figure out what all those other exposure factors are. What's our ingestion rate? What's our exposure frequency? What's our duration? What's the body weight? So we need to pull in other exposure factors and descriptors according to our dose calculations, which will vary slightly depending on the route of exposure. We have an exposure factors handbook. We have child-specific exposure factors where we can go and look these things up. There's a link here to where to find those. We also have default exposure factors. In 2014, a work group that I was part of helped to put together this OSWA directive where we laid out, you know, we don't need to go to these sources every time we do a risk assessment where we're plugging in numbers for a residential exposure. That's something that we do in every single risk assessment. Let's just come up with a default number. So a default number does not mean that it's the only number that can be used. It's the starting point. It's, if we don't have site specific reasons to deviate from that, we can plug in um, default exposure factors. Now, default exposure factors exist for residential and industrial commercial pretty much exclusively. So if we have other exposure scenarios like trespassers, like recreational, we're going to have to go to these sources and find exposure factors to plug in for ingestion rates for whatever that reflect our exposure of interest. Um, and so, while we do have some defaults, a lot of times these will be site specific. We document this in our RAGS-D tables and our risk assessments by laying out what is the value that we used for each of these exposure factors that are part of our equations. What are the units and where did we get them? So this is, the risk assessors will open this up and go, these are defaults. Yeah. Professional judgment. Yep, that one looks good. I agree with these sources. We're good to go. So um, we can look at these and quickly understand whether our um, our dose equations were run with the inputs that we would use, or if we need to push back on those. Deidre's got a question: do default exposure levels include children and pregnant women? They will typically include children, not the adults should be protective of pregnant women as well. When it gets into things like water, ingestion rates, sometimes a pregnant women will be a higher ingestion rate. So we would need to consider those on a site specific basis. But good question. There's some level of uncertainty in these that will vary by ingestion rate. So in our equation, we have many different um, exposure factors to consider, and they all have their own uncertainty. When we look this is what a sample table would look like from the exposure factors handbook. This one's for body weight. A body weight, there's a there's um, a survey that's done every few years called NHANES. It's the National Health Assessment National, forget what the E stands for, study that will go out and do a lot of things like weigh Americans and weigh lots of them. Um, that is, body weight is something that we can feel pretty confident in. You take a representative sample of enough Americans, you can understand what Americans weigh and have some confidence in that. So in the blue box underneath the table, it would say the overall confidence in the body weight recommendation is high. So we feel pretty good about that one. But let's look at soil and dust ingestion rates. Um, there's not a good way of figuring out how much dust on a child's hand ends up inside of his body, um, or how much dirt you incidentally ingest over the course of the day. There's a lot of indirect things. Some studies have followed babies around all day long and seen how many times their hand goes into their mouths, and you know estimating and seeing how much dust is on their hands in a separate study to kind of estimate how much goes in. There have been tracer studies where soil um, has been placed with a tracer chemicals, and you do a diaper study where you see how much came out of the baby to estimate how much dirt went in. It's a lot more complicated to figure out And so as a result, the overall confidence rating for the soil and dust recommendations is low, which is um, just kind of concerning, right? Every site we have, we're looking at this pathway and we have low confidence in the ingestion rates. So, we try to pick a conservative number for this because of that. So we're likely overestimating, but it would be great if we can figure out a good way of doing this. But for each of those exposure factors, we can understand the levels of uncertainty that are involved in each of these. And thank you, Hillary, for um, breaking out the NHANES acronym for me. Thank you. The examination survey. So it's not National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. Perfect. Now let's jump into the toxicity assessment. Um, this is called the dose response assessment for reasons I'll get into. And again, I'm going to go kind of quickly through toxicology. Hopefully, Lee will invite us back and we can have a whole separate training session just on toxicology. It's very interesting to me. Yeah, but it's kind of critical to this process because we figured out that there's dangerous things in the environment, that people are exposed to them. It's very important to understand, just how hazardous these things are, and that's what we do in a dose response assessment. So what we're going to do is we're going to review our contaminants of potential concern. We're going to go back to step one where we identified our COPCs, and we're going to start gathering toxicity information for all of those chemicals. We're going to go to our conceptual site model and understand how people might be exposed because there may be different tox values depending on the exposure route. So there may be inhalation. One piece of information might be for the inhalation route, while another is for ingestion, and we may need different um, tox values there. And then finally, we're going to go off to our kind of pre-identified sources of toxicity data to get the information that we need to quantify our risks at our site. So we don't have to open Google and start Googling how toxic is toxaphene. We have a hierarchy for selecting kind of EPA approved sources of tox values. We begin with EPA's IRIS. IRIS stands for the Integrated Risk Information System. That's EPA's gold standard. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Tier two, our next step, if there's not an IRIS value, if there's an IRIS value, that's where we end. We use that IRIS value, that's the gold standard. If there's not one, there may be a provisional peer-reviewed toxicity value. A PPRTV is the acronym there. Those are kind of Superfund specific. EPA's IRIS program is agency-wide. PPRTVs are Superfund specific. If we don't have anything in either of those, then we go to tier three, and tier three is everything else. So that could be ATSDR, Cal EPA, open literature. So our integrated risk information system, if you haven't visited this site, epa.gov/iris is where we go to find our tox data if it's in the iris system. The iris process is very detailed. That's why it's the gold standard. It involves agency reviews, public comments, external peer reviews, revisions. There's final agency review and interagency science discussions. So DOD and DOE get to weigh in on our proposals. The public gets to weigh in. We respond to those and we post a final assessment. If all goes well and we have a great data set and the wind's at our backs and the sun is shining, this process takes about 2 years. It is not quick, but what you get is pretty rock solid out of the back end. PPRTVs, on the other hand, kind of follow you can request these And I have made requests to the Superfund Technical Support Center. It's an ORD group in Cincinnati where they have toxicologists who are ready to jump in. You've got a key chemical at your site, and you've got some iffy tox data. The risk assessor may ask the Superfund Technical Support Center to develop a PPRTV for your site. Well, and for the chemical specifically, that can be used at any site. They follow the same general program as the IRIS without public comment periods, interagency review, within agency reviews. It's kind of Superfund specific. There is some external peer review just to make sure that we're not making things up, but these can be done pretty quickly. These could be done in like 3 to 6 months, which is nice. Other sources I mentioned, HESDR tox profiles. There are state agencies like Cal EPA that have very robust toxicology programs that kind of come up with their own numbers. And if it comes down to it, we may have to just start looking at scientific literature, but this is a last resort of just kind of looking at individual studies to get these values. So what we get when we're interested in looking at tox data for carcinogens and non-carcinogens. So basically, in risk assessments, we kind of split the potential health effects into two groups: cancer and everything that's not cancer. So we call those, non-cancer health effects. A chemical could cause both, could cause cancer as well as, kidney issues or, lung disease, whatever. And so, we may have cancer and non-cancer health data to pull in into our risk calculations. We call this section a dose response curve, and I don't call it the dose response assessment because something that we get in studies is a dose response curve. And I don't want to get too far into the toxicology today, but would love to come back and talk with you more about toxicity at length. But the dose response assessment is basically suggesting that this is what we get from an animal study or a human study on a contaminant, where the idea is that as the dose increases, the health effects that we're interested in will go up. So which follows, right? That should make sense. If something is causing health effects, more of it is going to cause more of the effect. So we get, this is kind of the classic dose response curve. It's S-shaped. There are other shapes we won't get into today, but what's kind of the takeaway here is that there are some safe levels. Down at 5, like 7 and 10 milligrams per kilogram dose, we aren't seeing any effects, and that's kind of critical. That's called the no observed adverse effect level, or the NOAL. And generally, we're interested in what's the highest concentration where we're not seeing any effects. A similar but different kind of idea is the low AL, which is our lowest observed adverse effect level. So this is the lowest concentration at which we're seeing things. So the important thing, the circles represent the doses that were administered in the study. It's not a continuum. So you have to extrapolate between the doses in the study. And I've gone way too in depth into this for today's discussion. But the idea here is that dose response is, as the dose increases, the effects increase, and that there should be some safe level that we can extrapolate on for use in our risk assessment. So our reference dose is a daily oral exposure that's likely to be without an appreciable risk of health effects. Via the inhalation route, it's called a reference concentration. And to come up with our reference dose, we identify that threshold. Where is that safe threshold? And then we identify some uncertainties and we account for that by dividing by uncertainty factors. Some uncertainties may be it's an animal study and it's rats and we're people. We're different species. That there's some uncertainty there. The rats in the study are as genetically similar as can be, as is possible, which is great because it kind of eliminates some potentially confounding issues. But humans vary genetically very much, so there's that genetic variability, uncertainty that to consider. We might have only a few studies uh, as opposed to other chemicals that may have hundreds of studies. So all of these are potential sources of uncertainty. So we take that no AL or low AL if it's all we have, but we want to start with our no AL. Divide it by uncertainty factor, and we get a reference dose. And that's what that is when I talk about getting tox data. That's what I'm talking about. We want to get a reference dose for non-cancer or a cancer slope factor, which is similar but different for carcinogens. This is kind of looking at that idea of uncertainty factors where we have our average animal, our average human, our sensitive human. There's this gap of uncertainty between animals and humans. There's this gap of uncertainty between our average human and maybe somebody who's a little more sensitive, genetically predisposed to react poorly to a chemical, et cetera, that we can incorporate in there. Cancer toxicity values are different. We don't get a reference dose. First, we get an assessment of whether the chemical is a carcinogen or not. So in IRIS, this is a little table that pops up, and it tells us that here's toxaphene. It's a B2, which is a classification. It's a probable human carcinogen based on animal studies, and it lays that out. We also get a cancer slope factor, and I won't go into that today. That's for our future talks discussion, where we extrapolate a number to show how potent that carcinogen is, and that cancer slope factor is used in our risk assessment calculations. So once we have all that data, again, there's a table for it. We lay it out, and we can look at what our primary target organs are for non-cancer. We can look at our uncertainty factors, which is giving us sort of a, just looking at these two chemicals, we know that there's greater uncertainty in a tox value for bis-2-ethyl phthalate than for 1,4-dioxane. That's important just from us understanding the amount of uncertainty for chemical by chemical as we're working through our risk assessment. For cancer, cancer carcinogenic chemicals, we would have a similar table back here where it lays out, is it a carcinogen? What's our source? And what's that cancer slope factor that we're interested in for use in our equation? So again, everything is laid out so that we can look at this and agree. Your risk assessor, when they're reviewing your risk assessments, is looking at, did I agree with that exposure point concentration? Did I agree with those exposure factors that went into the dose equation? And then finally, here, do I agree? Are these the tox values that EPA would recommend or would pick? It's all laid out for us to go back and review. All right, moving on, we're to our final step, the risk characterization. And this is where we put numbers to the risks. And if you get nothing else out of this, I want everybody tuning in today to understand what the risk numbers are when we're talking about risk. When we start talking about 1 times 10 to the minus 4, 3 times 10 to the minus 6, and HI of 32, that you understand what those numbers mean for your site. So let's dive into this last step. So what we're going to do is we're going to quantify risks for each individual chemical, for each route and scenario. So we want to, 1,4-dioxane, we're going to quantify risks for inhalation, dermal, and ingestion in soil and water. Everywhere that chemical is a COPC, we're putting a number to it. We're calculating risks for that. Then we're going to combine all those risks within each pathway and scenario. So each residential drinking water number, we're going to add up all the risks for all the chemicals that were COPCs for that. Then we're going to add up all the risks for each, our residential scenario. We're going to have soil risk, groundwater risk, inhalation risks, whatever was relevant for your site, and add all those up to come up with our total risks. So we're giving you two numbers. So we're going to give you a cancer risk, and we're going to give you a non-cancer hazard quotient or hazard index. So our cancer risk is the probability of developing a cancer that's above the overall cancer risk to the US population because of the exposure being assessed. We call that an excess lifetime cancer risk, and it's the probability of developing cancer above your overall risk of developing cancer, which I'm sorry to tell you is something like 1 in 3 or 1 in 4, depending on the source of information that you're looking at. So this is, above that. So it's basically what's the probability of getting cancer based on exposure to the chemicals at your site. Non-cancer health effect is a ratio between that reference dose that I was explaining how we derived and your concentration, your dose, not your concentration, sorry, your dose that we calculated over the reference dose, and you get a ratio. You're going to get two different numbers, and you cannot sum. We're going to sum all the cancer risks and all the non-cancer risks, but we can't sum cancer and non-cancer. They're separate numbers that we look at individually.
Hey, Tim, before you go
Yeah.
on, Marsha raised her hand. I didn't know if she had a
Okay.
question for you.
Sure.
Marsha, did you have a question?
No, sorry, that was an accident.
Oh, okay,
I took
sorry.
my hand down.
All
Keep
right.
going, Tim. She's awake.
I will keep chugging then. So, what's safe? It's not something that the risk assessors came up with. This is something that comes up in communities when we talk about within EPA's acceptable risk range. Community members will say, well, nothing is safe. It's like, okay, well, unfortunately, the NCP lays out what is safe for us. It's our what's laid out in the NCP is our risk range. So we have, this talks about anything between 10 to the minus 4 and 10 to the minus 6 is our acceptable risk range. If we have unacceptable risk, then 10 to the minus 6 shall be used as the point of departure for determining remediation goals. So it's interesting here, and this is something that comes up quite a bit, is that in order for there to be an unacceptable risk, we have to be above a 10 to the minus 4 or 1 in 10,000 excess lifetime cancer risk for it to be unacceptable. But once we trigger that level of unacceptable, we go back to 10 to the minus 6 as a starting point for developing our cleanup goals. So that there's a little bit of it. It's an interesting way of doing things, but it's laid out in the NCP. So the NCP lays out what is safe.
Adar has a question for you.
Yeah.
Tim,
Yes.
it's this slide and last slide, the 10 to the minus 4, you're talking about the carcinogen risk, right? There is cumulative site risk. Am I correct?
Yes.
And that is for multiple chemicals or for single chemical?
This is based on multiple chemicals. So your total cancer risk needs to exceed 10 to the minus 4 for it to be unacceptable.
Okay, for multiple chemicals
For
combined.
multiple chemicals combined. Yep.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
what's interesting here is that it's the NCP is silent on non-cancer. And that could be because it's a ratio of your concentration and your dose and a safe dose. And if you're above the safe dose, then that's unacceptable. It might be more straightforward. Let me get to this. Well, let me get to a few more slides here that might answer some of your questions. So the calculation for calculating the excess lifetime cancer risk is pretty straightforward. We take our cumulative daily intake or our daily dose that we calculated in our exposure assessment and multiply it by our slope factor, and we get a number like 3 times 10 to the minus 4. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. We assume that cancer risks are additive, that they would just add one to the other. That's a simplification, but it's sort of the best we can do psychologically to understand mixtures at our site. So we assume them to be additive, and that may not be strictly true. What I mean by that is the true effects may be if you've got two carcinogens together, it may not be a 1 + 1. It might be a tenfold increase in potential risk. But we don't necessarily know all the different combinations that may exist to be able to quantify them that way. So we're assuming that they're additive. And this is
Tim.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yep.
On that one, when you do the cancer risk, you're only calculating the risk for those chemicals or substances that are carcinogen. You don't include the non-carcinogens in this thing, right?
Correct.
You may have. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. I find this a handy tool for communicating this slide. What the hell we're talking about? We're talking about 10 to the minus 4, 10 to the minus 6. First of all, what's key to take away is that these are negative exponents. So 10 to the minus 4 is a bigger number than 10 to the minus 6. What a 10 to the minus 4 risk means is that there's a 1 in 10,000 risk of developing cancer versus 1 in a million at 1 times 10 to the minus 6. We'll sometimes calculate a 10 to the minus 5 just for completeness. And that would be in the middle. That'd be a 1 in 100,000 chance of developing cancer. The NCP just laid out that anything within 10 to the minus 6 and 10 to the minus 4 is acceptable. Anything less than 10 to the minus 6, and we calculate these risks all the time, 10 to the minus 7, 10 to the minus 8, those are so low that they're called de minimis. We don't need to worry about them any further. Anything above 1 times 10 to the minus 4 is unacceptable, and typically we need to take some action here. So our cleanup goals, again, so we trigger here at 1 in 10,000. Our cleanup goals will come back here as a starting point, but our cleanup goals can extend anywhere within this range on a site-specific basis if we have a reason to move off of 1 times 10 to the minus 6. It's too expensive is not often a good reason to move off of 10 to the minus 6. Just heads up. When you roll into the RDT meeting and say I chose a 10 to the minus 5 cleanup goal because it's $1 million less, that's typically not going to fly. You have to have some other reason to move off. Again, our non-cancer risk, we have our cumulative daily intake or our dose, our daily dose at our site divided by the reference dose. So our reference dose is our safe dose that we extrapolated from our studies. Our cumulative daily intake is our dose at our site. Divide one by the other, and you get a ratio. Generally, so what does an HQ of 3.2 means? It means you're on, the unsafe side of that. another way that you can communicate this is that it's 3.2 times greater than the safe level. It's just a simple comparison. It is not a unitless probability, so we don't know how likely these health effects are to occur. It's just above our safe level. It's above that reference dose by some amount. So Kathy has brought up, I thought we did HQs by organ system. Yes, I didn't get into that today, but so what Kathy means is back here, we were looking at our primary target organs when we're looking at our non-cancer. And so the liver, the kidney, the liver. So if we were calculating an individual hazard quotient for each of these chemicals, these two chemicals, the first two, are both impacting the liver. So we could add those together to look at things. So generally speaking, what we're going to do first is we're going to calculate our cumulative risk for everything. We're just going to look at what our hazard index is for all the chemicals. And if they're less than 1, we're good. If it's greater than 1, then we can start looking at the target organs or the organs that these chemicals can impact and start to segregate them by target organ. And as long as the chemicals are not impacting any particular organ system with a hazard index greater than 1, then they could still be acceptable. So that's a little more complicated than I was meaning to get today, but it's certainly an important part of this. And again, you will have a table at the back of your risk assessment, the RAGS Part D, that lays out what I've been talking about. So you can see there's carcinogenic and non-carcinogenic risk is calculated for each chemical depending upon if it has tox information for cancer and non-cancer. So you'll see that's not the case for all of the chemicals. It's added up by, well, a risk for ingestion and dermal and inhalation has been calculated for a total risk for each of those. And then we've added up all of our chemicals and have ended up, with all of our risk, totally our total groundwater risk, I just took a piece of the table, is 4 times 10 to the minus 4, which, as you know from this discussion, is unacceptable, right? The total hazard index is 73. We can segregate that by target organ, but the chances are it's looking like we're going to have, no matter how we split this, we're going to have unacceptable cancer, non-cancer hazard index going forward that will need to be addressed. Okay, so Rob has asked in the comments, can you do a little comparison to the risk of cancer overall? 1 in 2 for men and 1 in 3 for women. This is an argument that sometimes gets thrown out at meetings with OFAs. I don't know who OFAs are, PRPs in some communities. That gets into, that's an epidemiology question, which really, other than explaining, our cancer risks are much lower than your overall risk for cancer. Other federal agencies, yeah. So I wouldn't split hairs because it doesn't matter whether our background risk is 1 in 2, 1 in 3, 1 in 4. Those numbers, by sex, probably not for our decision making at our site. So, but to get, and again, I caveated my initial 1 in 3, 1 in 4, Rob, with it depends on who you're talking to, as well as, again, if you want to segregate by men or women. Here's another example of a risk summary from the same risk assessment. where our cumulative risk was 1e to the -5, and our cumulative hazard quotient was 0.09. Those are both acceptable. So our future trespasser visitor at that site is not going to drive any cleanup decisions. So we can take our trespasser visitor off the table and say the risks are acceptable for them. So what you get at the end of that is the text may say something like on-site future residents, cancer risks and non-cancer risks are unacceptable for future residents based on their exposure to these media. The COCs are contaminants of concern. This is important. These are, we started off with a long list of chemicals. Well, then we screened them and got contaminants of potential concern. Now we're screening them further to identify chemicals of concern. Chemicals of concern contribute appreciably to unacceptable risk to this 4 times e to the -4, to this hazard quotient of 73. The chemicals that are involved in contributing to that are now our contaminants of concern going forward. You may have a nifty table like this, which is great to have in your table, in your risk assessment, that lays out what our chemicals of concern are our contaminants of concern. These are all the chemicals that we're going to need to come up with cleanup goals for. So we will need to have, DRO cleanup goals for the construction worker, for residential, ground, et cetera. So Deidre has asked that community members asked how to find a doctor that can test for environmental exposures. Is there a type of doctor or a way to find them that you know of? There's PASU contacts for kids, but not adults. You can, all that we can do is refer them to their private physician or the public health unit in their communities. That's not something that EPA can involve. That's a public health function that's handled by others, which is not great. But if you have ATSDR at your meetings, they can help put people in touch with MDs. They have and doctors who are fluent in environmental exposures that can talk with them and tell them, what kinds of tests they might want to look at. So some metals are pretty easy. You can look at those in blood. Some things like, carbon tetrachloride might be a little more difficult to look at. And at the end of this, the last part of the risk assessment should be something like this, where there's remedial goal options that have been calculated for to meet these goals. So at this particular site for this particular exposure scenario, so the construction worker, there's no carcinogens that are COCs for the construction worker. However, there are these non-cancer chemicals of concern. Here's potential cleanup goals that you, the risk manager, get to choose between going forward. So usually it's the residential table here that would drive risk at a site, and it's the one that you would pick because they would be the lowest numbers. But if everything's together, you should be able to take this table as it exists and drop it into your feasibility study. The feasibility study will then be where you, the risk manager, say, I'm cleaning up to 10 to the -5, I'm cleaning up, there's no numbers here, but just for example, or 10 to the -6, or an HQ of 1, or whatever numbers, you are, as the risk manager, are selecting. We're happy to advise on that, but that's a risk manager call. I want to circle back to screening levels and where they come from, because you needed to know all this other information in order to understand where they come from. So if we're able to calculate, I've shown how we've calculated risks, probabilities, where we get 1 times 10 to the minus 4, whatever, 3 times 10 to the minus 6, how those are calculated. If we rearrange the equation, we can solve algebraically for what's the concentration that would result in no greater than a 10 to the minus 6 cleanup, 10 to the minus 6 risk, or a 10 to the minus 4 or whatever. So that algebraic reconfiguration of the equation using default exposure factors as part of that is where the RSLs come from. So typically, our screening levels for the remedial program would be 10 to the minus 6 is the RSL for cancer. Or it could be based on a hazard index or a hazard quotient of 0.1 or 1. RMLs in the removal program are typically set at either 10 to the minus 4 or 1 or 3 hazard index. But that's how those numbers are calculated. We just flip the equation around and solve for that concentration in the environment that leads to a dose that's acceptable, and that equals these target risk levels that we want to identify up front. So if you go to our regional screening levels table, if you're interested in going to look or screening data yourself, you can go to the site. The link is here. Some of you may have experience doing this, or you've got data in and you're like, well, arsenic is 32. Is that above the RSL? You can, I get texts or, Teams messages all the time. Hey, what's the RSL for BAP? Hey, what's the, yeah, you can do that, or you can look it up yourself. But what ends up being confusing for a lot of folks is that you go to the RSL table and you're like, I want to get the RSL table, and you're presented with a bunch of tables, and this can be confusing. So let me break down what's going on with why there's so many tables. There are target risk levels are shown at the top. So, do you want the hazard quotient, the target hazard quotient for non-cancer to be 1 or 0.1? Typically, if you have lots of chemicals at your site, you're going to want to use 0.1. And the idea here is that you're not going to miss contaminants that could add up when we sum those when we sum the risks of those chemicals, could be more than 1 on their own. So we go to 0.1 as an initial screening. The tables are offered, each table is offered as a PDF or an Excel spreadsheet. I go to the Excel spreadsheets all the time as a first shot, because PDFs are kind of useless for how we use them. It's difficult to scroll through the PDF and see what you want to see. There's also all of these different tables by media. So if you're interested in a soil number, you might be tempted to go to the residential soil table and pull it up and pick between the 0.1 or 1. And I talked about 0.1. You would use the 1 if, there are sites where you have 1 contaminant, it's lead, it's toxaphene. That TEQ of 1 would be appropriate at those sites. But, again, so you may decide that, I've got a lot of chemicals. I'm interested in what the, either the 10 to the minus 6 or the total hazard quotient of the target hazard quotient of 0.1 is for these chemicals. I'm going to go to the residential soil. I'd advise against it, because what you're going to get is a table with a bunch of numbers on it. You're going to get so you're going to get the cancer numbers, the non-cancer numbers, and it's easy to make a mistake on what the actual RSL would be. What the summary table does is takes the lowest of the cancer and the non-cancer and present that as one number as the RSL. And that's the easiest and quickest way to do. So I would point you to the summary table. If you've got lots of contaminants or more than one, go to the end here where you have a target hazard quotient of 0.1 and then target risk level is 0.6. In the removal side, I know Siddhar's on, the removal management levels are different, and you would pick different tables. But for this is primarily an RPM audience. This is where I would point you. When you get that table, it's going to look something like this. This is again just a screen grab of the top. The blue information is all of the toxicity information that's going into the calculation. The green area is the chemical name. If you're having trouble finding a chemical, sometimes using the CAS number, the chemical abstract service number, is a good way to make sure that it's not called something else, or it's listed as a synonym here. And again, you have different exposure scenarios going across. I'm going to wrap up by talking about the difference between risk assessment and risk management. The people who work for me and me in a past life are risk assessors. We evaluate the risk, we help identify the uncertainties, we provide risk information to the risk manager, you, and we help to calculate those remedial goal options and help you choose between them. If you're choosing to move off of 10 to the minus 6, we can help make that case, those types of things. But you as a risk manager are considering the risk information plus all the other information that you need to make the decision at your site. So the risk is important because it's the driver, but you have other things that you're considering in your site information as well. You are the one that makes decisions for the sites. I often get asked, well, what should I do? And I'm happy to offer an opinion, but you are the risk decider. You're the one delegated in the NCP to make these decisions. You're the one whose signature goes on these things. You're the one who goes to RDT and presents. You're the one who gets to stand up in front of the public and defend these things. So you've got a lot on your plate as well as the risk manager. You're the one who chooses the site-specific cleanup goals. Options have been presented by the risk assessors. You pick which ones are in there, and finally, you select the remedy and carry it forward. I included this as just to kind of emphasize again when you the risk manager are making a decision at your site, you consider the risk assessment as part of it, but you've got all these other things going on that you're looking at as well. You've got attorneys who are every bit as involved as your risk assessors, who have opinions on ARARs and other things that may come into impact. Funding. Do we have the money this year, or are we going to wait? Political factors are hopefully not too heavy in our decision making. Sometimes technical impracticability comes into play. We've got one or two sites in the region where we've done that now. We can come up with a cleanup number, but if it's technologically impossible to ever reach that number, that could change your decision as the risk manager. And kind of finally, when we're deciding on the actions, I laid out that equation earlier, that hazard times exposure equals risk. So there's really, it points to the things that we can do to address that. We can eliminate the hazard by digging up all that contaminated soil, treating all the contaminated water, et cetera, or we can limit the exposure. Limiting the exposure by itself, by putting up fish consumption advisories, putting a fence around the site, are not our primary, or not our preferred way of addressing the risk. But sometimes that's all we can do as well. We can't dig up all the contaminated sediment, which is going into the fish, so we prevent people from eating fish, etc. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. That was a lot delivered pretty quick. I've been talking a long time, and it feels like it went by quick for me anyway. But your mileage may vary, but I'm happy to answer any risk assessment questions anybody might have.
Wow, Tim.
Eric says, nice setup for the remedial action objective discussion. Great, Eric.
Yes.
Nice to tee that up for you.
And May. Well, Tim, while people are thinking about their questions, I did add some of the things you had mentioned, building data quality objectives to the list, toxicology, and then I also added calculating remedial goal options as well as cleanup levels.
Cool.
So we got 3 good topics coming out of today's training. Oh, see, I knew I could talk and get you a question. Go ahead, Rob.
So Tim, I just wanted to step back to the question that I asked and about, there's a risk of cancer that exists mainly in the developed world is where we get our numbers from, but it's, whether it's 1 in 2, 1 in 3, 1 in 4, it's a cancer risk that exists that's independent of Superfund sites or our cleanups, and there's nothing that we have to do with that. That what you're talking about with the lifetime cancer risk, we clean up at our Superfund sites is what we can control because it's a risk that no one has chosen to be exposed to that we can do something about. Whereas the other risks are for all kinds of cancers combined, melanomas on your skin and that's a risk, but you hear that thrown out all the time. I've heard it in community meetings, actually. I've heard it from PRPs. I've heard it from other federal agencies. And so it's important to be able to say, look, that's a risk that's out there that's not from this Superfund site. We're talking about risk that comes from the site that we're cleaning up. That was what I was trying to get to, not poke holes at you.
No, and it can become a risk communication issue as well, because we're talking about carcinogens at our sites, and I have cancer, therefore my cancer came from your site, and we deal with that all the time. But the high prevalence of cancers generally in a population kind of highlights why it's so hard for us to say, yes, your cancer came from this site, because it could have been from any of the many other things that you've been exposed to over your lifetime, your genetic predisposition to certain cancers, and on and on. So that's a tough thing to explain, or to not sound like you're minimizing. It's like, I understand your concern. What has been helpful in some cases that ATSDR has gotten involved, and a doctor has said, the chemicals at this site don't cause the cancer that you have. And we can say that definitively. Other cancers we can't, but it was, some cancers are very specific, like mesothelioma is not going to come from the TCE at the site, right? That's going to be an asbestos related exposure. So sometimes we can get, and some, John said that's ATSDR CDC's job. Yes, we don't need to make those pronouncements at all. Do not tell someone that their cancer is not from your site. Say, you can understand their concern and point them to folks that can answer their specific questions, and you especially don't want to do it in front of 100 people as well.
Yeah, and for the newer RPMs, we don't expect you to be experts in this, and that's why you have your
Yeah.
team of risk assessors. And I know that something that was always helpful for me was to include your Department of Health or ATSDR at your large public meetings. So they have your community members who have health concerns have the experts to talk about, and you're not handling
Yeah.
those questions all by yourself.
Yeah, and I am our division's liaison with ATSDR. So if at your site you're getting, did my cancer come from this site? I've lived next door to the site all my life, and I have some chronic health issues. What do I tell my doctor? When you start getting those questions, reach out to me and I can connect you with the people that you need um, to talk with them directly. Because that is 100% not your risk assessor's job, not your job to answer those questions.
I was just going to add to that, Tim. This is Deidre. At Hercules site, we've already had ATSDR out there, and they were great at the public meeting, and we're going to have them out again as we get a little further down the line. Do you think it'd be helpful to tell them the difference between consultation versus assessment for ATSDR?
Sure. And I'm not 100% sure that I know the difference. But the there's a couple of, ATSDR has a couple of, they can come to our public meetings and talk about things, but they also have formal roles. They can be petitioned by members of the public to weigh in on things. This comes up at some of our emergency response sites, like, hey, there was this train derailment in my community. What are my health risks? They can kind of consult on that kind of stuff. Basically, a consultation is going to be a relatively short kind of look at potential health risks. Every NPL site, so if your site is listed on the NPL, not a Superfund alternative or things, I think they're also required to do a public health assessment for every site on the NPL. And
I believe it's proposed to the NPL, Tim.
proposed? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm the liaison, and I'm not 100% on what they do.
And I was gonna so we asked them to do, because I had to look this up and talk to ATSDR about it too, but the consultation is a more in-depth one, and the assessment is less in-depth. People usually ask for an assessment, but at Hercules I asked them for a consultation because we've got so many people and it has such a long-lived history, and there's a lot of people that have cancer concerns.
So I had
it's very
those swapped in my
counterintuitive.
head. Yeah, but the public health assessment is sort of, is, as we were says, is required of all sites proposed to the NPO, and it's basically just another. It's in some ways redundant. They're basically doing a risk assessment based on our available data, which can arrive at different conclusions, which is fun when that happens. But yeah, and because we have different methodologies, they don't follow risk assessment guidance for Superfund. They have the Public Health Assessment Guidance Manual, PHAGM, that they use. And they're just different enough that sometimes they can arrive at a different conclusion. Sometimes they don't have all of our data, or while they're working on and it takes them about 2 years to do a public health assessment, to go through all the clearance. So sometimes, if site is proposed, here's the 12 samples we have. And then we list the site and we collect 300 more, and they don't have that additional data. There's all kinds of ways there could be a disconnect. One of the things I've been working on, I have the meet just before this session, I was on the phone with ATSDR because we're trying to set up standard monthly meetings where we talk about what they're doing for Superfund and what they need from us, so that we're aware of what's going on. It just happened on the site where they rolled out a public health assessment and blindsided the RPM, who had all this other data that they never asked for, or we didn't volunteer because we weren't aware of what was going on. And it created some friction. So we're trying to eliminate that now by having regular conversations with them going forward. So I'm meeting with them at least once a month. If you need them for anything at all, let me know and I can pull them in.
I think Rob had his hand up, but he put it down. Rob, did you want
Good.
to add anything else?
No, that was for the earlier comment.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Yeah, and Eric said he recently learned that any community can petition for a health assessment. It's not limited to Superfund. Yeah, that happens quite a bit. When I was talking to them today, they were petitioned to do a health assessment for ethylene oxide in Shelby County, Tennessee. They decide whether they're going to do that or not. It's not required. They were petitioned by Fort McClellan, by veterans who served at Fort McClellan to do a public health assessment. I think they declined because the questions that the veterans group was asking were not environmental related, they were occupational. I was exposed to these things. And it's like that's not a ATSDR function, that's OSHA.
Great.
And Brian has got some more information, more factually correct information
The only
about
thing
what
I'd add
ATSDR does.
on the public health assessment is that I found that sometimes there's a cooperative agreement between ATSDR and a state health department. And so the state health department may complete or conduct the public health assessment.
Yeah, and Lee, another future topic is if we want to have ATSDR come and explain all these things and what's involved and what they can do for us, we can ask those liaisons to come and chat. I think that would be a good conversation for us to all have.
Maybe we should do these meetings twice a month. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Well, thank you all for participating. A big shout out to Tim. Thank you so much for leading this effort and doing such an amazing job. And, really appreciate everyone being here and participating. This is really helpful to me and I'm hopefully to everyone else. So thank you guys. The next meeting training is May 10th. It is writing RAOs. And as Eric put a plug in, he is our lead on that. So I'm really excited. I think it's going to be a great one and it's really important. Looks like Amber wants to add one more thing. Go ahead, Amber.
I didn't, Lee. I'm sorry. I was trying to clap because it was such a great session.
Well, good. Thank you. All right, everyone. I will, once I get the recording, I will post it on the SEM SharePoint site under training and hopefully successfully. I'll also in the description add the number of hours that you can put this towards your core certification. And if anyone has any questions or any additional great ideas, please let me know and I'll add it to the topic list that I've got generated. So thanks again, everyone. And thank you, Tim.
Sure. And I'll get you the slides so you can post those too.
Sounds great.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks,
All right,
everybody.
have a great day, everyone.
See ya.
Thanks, y'all.